Today, we're digging into some source material that really outlines a major, maybe even historic, policy shift in how the U.S. handles counterterrorism. We're focusing specifically on that executive order from the Trump administration about Antifa.
Right. And the headline fact, the thing we need to get out there right away, is the designation itself, naming Antifa, the anti-fascist movement, a domestic terrorist organization through an executive order. That just, well, it changes the whole landscape instantly.
It really does, because when you look at the history which these sources lay out, you see how significant this is. For decades, U.S. counterterrorism policy, its whole structure, has been pointed outward at foreign threats.
That's exactly it. If you check the State Department's list right now, the official list of foreign terrorist groups, it's got around 219 organizations on it, and every single one is foreign. This order is the absolute first time that kind of designation, that weight, has been put on a group inside the U.S. We're talking about a whole new category of enforcement, really.
Okay, so that sets up our mission for this deep dive. We need to unpack this. What did the order actually say? What was the political climate that led to this? And maybe the biggest piece, what are the huge practical problems, the legal issues that pop up the second you try to label a decentralized movement like this a terrorist group?
Yeah, it's one thing to declare war on an organized army, quite another to declare it on, say, an idea, right? Let's get into the documents.
Let's do it. Starting with the order itself, the actual policy language. When the administration put this out, what were federal agencies actually told to do?
Well, the language is pretty forceful. The directive explicitly tells federal agencies to, quote, investigate, disrupt, and dismantle, unquote. And that applies to individuals and groups who identify with Antifa, or even those just supporting related activities.
Yeah.
So this isn't just talk. It's an order to deploy federal power against a domestic movement.
And the sources show the administration wasn't shy about the politics behind it. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt basically confirmed it, saying the order was about fulfilling a campaign promise Trump made before the last election.
Oh, absolutely. They were quite upfront that this was checking a box, fulfilling a key political pledge. And you saw that reflected in the rhetoric, too. The sources mentioned Trump's own words, calling Antifa a sick, dangerous, radical left disaster. You almost need that kind of strong framing if you're planning to use federal tools against, well, dissent or what you see as ideological opposition.
But let's pause there. If there's zero historical precedent, like you said, and all the counterterrorism tools we have were designed for groups like Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah, what actually happens when you try to aim that machinery inward at domestic targets?
It definitely fails as a policy change, but maybe more importantly, it creates this real friction. The whole counterterrorism setup, its legal basis, its operational methods, they're built for foreign threats. Situations where maybe certain constitutional rights don't apply in the same way, or where military or intelligence actions are the norm, using that same framework domestically, that's where things get tricky. That line between counterterrorism and potentially suppressing dissent gets very blurry very fast. That's the historical significance, the weight of this move.
Which leads us right into maybe the biggest practical hurdle for actually enforcing this, the difference between an ideology and an organization.
That's the absolute core of the problem, isn't it? If the order is to disrupt and dismantle, law enforcement usually needs a thing to target, a structure. But as our sources keep pointing out, Antifa doesn't have that. There's no formal leadership, no central office, no membership cards. It operates more like, well, like a banner people rally under, or a shared philosophy, a decentralized approach.
And that's not just playing with words, right? It creates a massive legal and operational roadblock. Federal agencies themselves, historically, haven't treated Antifa as some unified group with a hierarchy. They usually describe it as an ideology.
Exactly. Think about how the FBI or other agencies usually take down criminal groups or terrorist cells. They use laws aimed at structure, at organization. The sources bring up RICO, for instance, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act.
Right. And for those of you maybe not deep in federal statutes, RICO is built to dismantle ongoing structured criminal enterprises. You target the money flow, the leaders, the established connections between members. It's about the organization itself.
You go after the command structure, the hierarchy. If a foreign group has, say, an emir and lieutenants and specific ways they get funding, those are the pressure points agencies use. But if Antifa is really just, as most agree, this loose collection of people who share certain anti-fascist views and sometimes use similar tactics, how do you apply those tools? How do you investigate, disrupt, and dismantle a philosophy?
It seems like if you can't use the tools designed for organizations, the only path left is to target individuals. based on what? Based on their supposed identification with the ideology or their support for it. And that feels like it could cast a really wide net, doesn't it? Potentially pulling in protesters, activists, maybe even people just expressing certain views online.
And that's precisely why this distinction matters so much for you, the listener, to grasp. Policing an organization usually means going after criminal acts committed by members of that specific group. But policing an ideology that could easily slide into policing association or even just speech, and that runs right up against the First Amendment. The implications for civil liberties here are just enormous.
Okay, we definitely can't talk about this policy without grounding it in the politics of that specific moment. These things don't happen in a bubble. Let's shift to the immediate political drivers and the backlash it caused.
Yeah, the sources draw a pretty clear line connecting the timing of this order to a specific tragic event. The designation came shortly after the killing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk in Utah. Authorities had described that killing as politically motivated. So that event created this intense, immediate political pressure cooker.
And President Trump clearly connected the dots publicly. At Kirk's memorial service, the sources say he blamed the violence directly on radical left rhetoric. That essentially framed the Antifa designation as a direct answer to that specific act of violence and the broader political tension.
It gave the administration a sort of political justification or cover to roll out this really aggressive new label. But predictably, it was met with instant, very strong opposition, particularly from Democrats. They saw it less as a safety measure and more like a political tool.
Yeah, the sources quote Representative Benny Thompson. He was the top Democrat on the House Homeland Security Committee then, and his criticism was sharp. Thompson flat out called the designation incorrect.
And he didn't pull any punches about what he thought the real goal was. He argued that labeling a loose movement like Antifa doesn't actually achieve anything practical for security. Instead, he said it serves as, quote, an excuse for the Trump administration to stifle dissent, investigate anyone or any group they don't like, punish their enemies, and potentially label any American they want as a terrorist.
That's a really serious charge. Essentially saying the order was designed to expand government surveillance powers to target political opponents by exploiting the vagueness of who or what constitutes Antifa.
And it's worth noting, this wasn't happening in isolation. There was a broader effort, it seems, to manage the public conversation around Kirk's death. The sources remind us about FCC Chair Brendan Carr leaning on Disney to suspend Jimmy Kimmel Live after Kimmel made some critical comments following Kirk's death. The show did come back quickly, but it points to a wider pattern.
Right. So seeing these things together, the terrorist designation, the pressure on a media outlet suggests the administration was trying to, well, control the narrative and push back against criticism tied to the events that sparked the order.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together for you. What we're looking at here is an executive order putting this incredibly powerful terrorist label on a U.S.-based movement for the very first time. It was clearly pushed forward by intense political events and rhetoric, but it immediately ran into this fundamental problem. The group being targeted is seen by law enforcement itself more as an ideology than a concrete organization they can actually dismantle using existing tools.
And the lasting importance, really, is that shift it represents. Taking U.S. counterterrorism policy, which was always focused outward, and turning it inward. That brings a whole host of constitutional questions, practical challenges, especially when you're using these heavy-duty tools against Americans involved in political expression.
Which leaves us with a really critical kind of hanging question, especially since the definition is so loose. The administration didn't really specify how law enforcement was supposed to enforce this against a group with no formal leadership. So how might support for Antifa or identification with it actually be defined on the ground by the agents doing the investigating? That ambiguity itself, that's where the real power and maybe the potential danger of this kind of designation lies. How is that definition going to be shaped in practice?
A really complex situation with potentially huge consequences for policy and rights in the U.S. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.